I think one of the most frustrating parts of this COVID-19 is that it's not our fault. We didn't do anything to deserve this. And when suffering isn't deserved, it makes it even more difficult and causes more anguish and frustration. You know, when a child is punished by dad or mom, they're really more upset that they got caught than anything else. We might fight a ticket for illegal parking, but when we're honest, we understand why we got the ticket. Such suffering is deserved. It isn't fun, but when it's our fault, we get it. But this virus isn't our fault. None of us caused it to be. Oh, we can try to look for a scapegoat, to blame someone, blame a lot of people, as many have done, but often in a broken world, there are just things that simply are bad. Simply what we call sin. We live in a creation that isn't perfect. It's not what God created or intended. But none of us feel any blame for this virus. And being locked in houses and separated from people we love and care about, having to wear masks, just seems like cruel and unusual punishment. It isn't fair. Now this Sunday, the epistle is from 1 Peter chapter 3. And the letter was written to Christians who really were suffering during the time of Emperor Nero in Rome. It was written to Christians who lived in the region of Turkey and Greece today. Now Nero was probably responsible for burning Rome down so he could build new palaces. But then everyone figured out he had done it, and so rather than take the blame, he decided to blame Christians. They did it. He made them the scapegoat. And so many were beaten, many were pulled out of their houses, many were killed. They weren't at fault for the suffering that they were enduring. And that was much worse than anything we face today. Much worse. They were killed. Not for hurting anyone, not for doing anything bad, but simply because they chose to believe in Jesus. So they were easy targets. They were enduring suffering that wasn't fair, and Peter wrote a letter to them to try and give them hope, even in the midst of suffering. And here's part of what he said in that letter. He said, it's better to suffer for doing good, if it is God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. Now, at first glance, that maybe doesn't seem to help. Doesn't even sound reassuring. The idea that unjust suffering has some kind of blessing. But think about what Peter meant. His point was, if you have been bad and suffer, it's because you've been bad. It's because you've done something, living as you shouldn't have lived. If you were good, the benefit is you didn't do anything wrong. And there's always virtue in doing what is right. Suffering is still suffering, but why bring it on yourself? If you have been bad, you have double guilt, because you have the guilt and then you have the suffering, and both hurt. But if you're not guilty, you can hold your head high even in the midst of suffering. Now, Peter reminded the readers of this letter of the purpose of Christ's suffering on our behalf. It was because we will suffer in many ways at different times. And for Jesus to endure what he didn't deserve out of love for us, he assured us that when we face difficult moments, difficult times, and especially when we face death, he has already endured it. He has already been there, and he stands with us in every similar moment. Remember the scene at Calvary where two guilty guys were suffering on crosses on either side of Jesus. One finally figured out what was going on. And he said, hey, we're suffering because we deserve it. But this Jesus did nothing wrong. And that love that he felt from Jesus changed a dying criminal's life forever. Peter went on to say that Jesus was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Death could not hold Jesus forever. And in the same way, our spiritual lives will continue even after death. That is what the miracle of Easter is all about. Now, in Peter's day, Gentile Christians literally faced death for no good reason. And he reminded them that they were still blessed because they were who they were and because they knew the love of Jesus. They had done nothing wrong, and Jesus had done for them more than they ever could have imagined. Not even the power of an emperor could take that gift away. So even in the midst of undeserved suffering, they were blessed. Today we are fearful for those we love. We are sick and tired of being confined and hiding behind masks. But for the most part, we are merely inconvenienced. We aren't suffering. And even if we do suffer or die, our promise is that the blessing of our relationship with God will not suffer. And no matter what, we can hold our heads high. So let that blessing color how you live. Be faithful in prayer. Make sure you reach out to people who might be suffering all alone. Keep the faith. Pray for the gift of patience, the gift of love, and the gift of peace. Now, we've all seen signs that say, we're all in this together. Yes, we're all suffering. But Easter's sign is much more reassuring. It's the one that God wrote that says, I am with you. Now, that is the blessing that brings peace, and it will last.